It's the first crime against humanity. The crime to ever classify and invent superiorities and invent inferiorities.
I mean, much has been written on the question of the zone of non-being,
yes.
Spaces where certain human lives don't matter to the same degree as the zone of being. So I'm thinking about how this contributes to or speaks to the sort of the ordinariness of violence.
And actually, one thinks it's obvious, but when you start to think about it, it's not actually.
So the first question is pretty obvious. If you're going to dehumanize people, then the response has to be, what in the world is a human being? What is a human being? All right? If somebody walked up to many of you and said, hey, yo, you're not a human being. Well, your initial response might be to say, what are you talking about? I'm as human as you are. But if you were to do that, you would have lost. And the reason is, should you make those who set as a standard racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, dehumanization, should they stand as the standard of your humanity? So you may say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be the standard.
I think that's a very interesting question from Prof. Lewis Gordon. Like, the question of what it means to be human is a very important question for current times. But I think a simple answer for me would be, to his question would be, I'm a human and I identify as such. But I think William and Melissa obviously have more around what makes the differences of which other humans are worth more than others. Yeah.
Yes, I also think it's a fascinating question, and actually one thinks it's obvious, but when you start to think about it, it's not actually all that easy to answer. I think I would paraphrase the question into something like, what does it mean to treat someone like a human? You know, and then for me, a lot of that has to do with recognizing the fullness of a person's subjectivity, the fullness, their full emotional being, their full psychological being, their full capacity for feeling pain and suffering. And, you know, recognizing all of that and treating the person with a respect for all those capacities. And it also, in my opinion, I think more and more about this, is that to treat a person as a human is also to recognize their capacity for change and growth. Because I think a large part of what happens when we don't recognize the humanity of others is that we box them in or fix them within a particular way of thinking about them, which is what Prof. Gordon also talks about. When dominant, powerful people fix other people in terms of our understandings of them, and we don't allow the capacity for people to become, rather than just simply to be what we understand them to be, or want them to be understood to be.
Yeah. And another thing that comes to mind while you were speaking is the question of naming. So you're talking about boxing, and I think from my end, the question of being human speaks to how do we name people? How do we name bodies that we consider to be human? So in different contexts, for example, when we talk about the question of dehumanization or the process of dehumanization or that particular exercise in spaces where genocide has taken place, we tend to find that quite a lot of names have been given to groups of people so that they can sort of be unhuman, or what we predominantly know as dehumanization. So I'm thinking about, in the case of South Africa and immigration, when xenophobic violence was at its peak, and also in pockets of xenophobic violence, the use of the name Kwere Kwere to refer to immigrants, and also if you think about the Zimbabwean case, the Gukurahundi, where the Shona the Shona armies or the ZANU-PF led armies killed the Ndebele, that there were also names such as roaches and attributed to the Ndebele. So I'm also thinking about how it also, to some degree, there's some sort of animalization of the other. And of course, we can talk further about the binary of the human and the animal, but that predominant assumption that if you name someone non-human, then you can begin to justify their dehumanization.
Right. I mean, for me, that's really right at the heart of what we're talking about, that binary. Because what makes us think, if we're saying you can't treat humans like animals, and if you name humans as animals, that you've then sort of got permission to maltreat them. What makes us think that it's okay to treat animals like that? To me, that is the big question that arises, is why would we not recognize animals in their fullness of being? Their capacity for feeling, their capacity for suffering, their desire to live, their willingness to become, their fullest self in the way that they are created, and I think that that's the big question, is like the whole binary is problematic.
What Melissa and Kudzai have just triggered is not just a big question, but I think it's the first crime against humanity. The crime to ever classify and invent superiorities and invent inferiorities. And in the process, what happens is not just the linear dehumanization of one by the other, but even the dehumanizer gets dehumanized in the process of inventing the non-humanity or inhumanity of the other. I call it the first crime because I believe this is what led to conquest.
Right.
The very idea that one people can conquer another and do what they want with that other, which led to enslavements, colonizations, imperialisms, and all that, which invented the inequalities that appear in our daily experiences here and there, especially in the global south. And Melissa, I think you touched on something fundamental in that beyond that colonization of the human, that conquest of one by the other, there's then the relationship that humans will now have with the nature. Our attitude to nature, how we step on the soil, our attitude to the air, our attitude to water, our attitude to plant and animal life has all become colonial, extractivist, exploitative, and very violent, to the extent that we now have a world that is increasingly becoming inhospitable. Nature is becoming unfriendly, all because of the original crime, which in philosophical terms we can call it the real fall of man. The day one person ever imagined that another is inferior to them and all that.
Yes. You make me think, of how traditional societies had a very different relationship to nature, to animals. One that much more understood our kinship with other beings, and understood that we were in relationship to the rest of the life that is on the planet, and the resources of the earth were not thought of as resources there to be used for our personal interests as human beings, but rather relationships that had to be cherished. And I think that fundamentally makes a difference, William. I would say that then makes a difference if we have that attitude towards nature, which deconstructs that vicious binary that we talked about, then you can't actually really do it to other people either. You can't, refuse to understand that it's relationship and not overt power that one exercises in interactions with each other.
Mm-hmm. And Melissa, you mentioned a very important term, and we use this quite a lot in our work, the question of power. And to sort of tie to what William was saying, I mean, much has been written on the question of the zone of non-being,
yes.
Spaces where certain human lives don't matter to the same degree as the zone of being. So I'm thinking about how this contributes to or speaks to the sort of the ordinariness of violence. And if we think about conquest that you mentioned, William, if we think about colonialism as a process and apartheid, particularly in South Africa, that it's a process that involved to a greater degree creation of certain zones of non-being, particularly if you think about the city planning, the townships, and the kind of violence that was wielded in these particular spaces by the apartheid government, but also how for Black people it creates a situation where there's more violence and more dehumanization. And I think it gets to a degree where for this kind of survival of people in these spaces, that human life seems to not really matter in particular moments. So I'm also thinking about how violence, structural violence as well, leads to a situation or leads to a context where humanity becomes very questionable, and people can actually momentarily not see each other as human because of constrained resources, but also because of power, the question of wanting to be the one at the center and in control of resources in various contexts. Yeah.
So would you say then, Kudzai, that the human is the being that we would not commit violence against? Do we have to dehumanize in order to commit violence against other people? Because it sort of seems to be what you're saying, and I think it's a wonderful definition.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking from the position of if we try to conceptualize human rights, for example, to say when we talk about human rights, we are saying it's something that we should all have access to. As every human should have access to. So basic water, for example, these are basic human rights standards. But in a moment when certain people don't have access to this, discursively and according to the state, they are not sort of being fitting into the definition of human from a state-centric perspective.
Yes.
So I'm seeing it in that way where when we think that everyone can be treated as human, that is actually not the truth, because the world we live in has a certain standard for what being human is, and I think that is predominantly like white, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, and if you etc. But if you fall outside of these categories, you stand the chance of losing. Or being treated as human.
Right.
Yes.
But Kudzai, I mean, you've really given me a new fascinating definition for human rights as the prevention of violence, including structural violence against a human being. It's like, so human rights are like the elimination of violence against people. Wow, thank you. That's a really fabulous definition.
Yes.
Yes.
Deeply. I think where we are going to that crime scene where conquest and monopoly began. Like when one source of power decides that I am human and you are not. I think that was the first step towards conquest. And the first step towards the monopolization of being human against the other. That is the crime of conquest, of colonization, and of domination. So before we really look at the human rights and the human right, we have to start with the human wrong of ever monopolizing being human, of ever conquering the identity of the human and not distributing it equally to the other, which then robbed the planet of recognition, which is one term that we came up with, of the other, including plants, animals, and the elements, which has brought us to this chaotic universe that we are living in, where violences are sprouting all over the place.
William, so does this mean that if we want to deeply enter into our humanity, it really does involve some humility?
Exactly.
Because what you're talking about to me sounds like arrogance.
Yeah.
The arrogance, the human wrong is arrogance.
Yes. That's the first crime where somebody decided, by somebody I also mean systems and structures, that they will disrecognize the life in other objects and in other subjects, and then monopolize being human and being alive to themselves, giving them then the license to commit violences, exploitations, oppressions, and the monopolization of resources at the expense of the rest. It all starts with making one the template, the prototype of being human, and then the rest as the other, which led to the whole spectrum of the criminalization of differences. If you are not like me, if you don't believe in my God, if you don't look like me, if you are not interested in what I'm interested in, then you are natural resources, then you are objects, then you are elements and substances that are there for my interests, for my desires and my fears.
But what you say also sounds like a kind of hoarding. It's like a kind of greed too. It's arrogance, but it's also a greed to pull all the good things towards yourself and away from the other.
Exactly. The colonization of the human, as it went with conquest and domination of the other, began with that hoarding, that monopoly, which led us to this very unmathematical and asymmetrical distribution of the world's resources. Because there's enough food to go around in the world, but there's that 1% of the human population that consumes on behalf of the other percentages. That's why there's that scramble for space, scramble for food, scramble for water, and scramble for oxygen, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah.
It began with monopoly.
And the idea that some people are more entitled to all of those than others.
To the access, yes.
And William, what you're talking to leads me to a question, and I think for you, Melissa, because all of these descriptions of greed and etc. that you've mentioned speak to what people loosely in conversations would say, oh, this is human nature. So I'm just thinking about this, there's this assumption that it is human nature to want to amass everything, to want to have all of the opulence to oneself, that selfishness and greed is human nature. I don't know if both of you could speak to this, but my question is more around where does this construction begin?
Yes.
And because it's quite problematic.
It's very problematic because it also it valorizes, it pulls forward and augments the selfish side of human nature. But actually, human beings are capable of great altruism, and of kindness, of generosity, of all of those things that are not sort of, when we say that's human nature, we're sort of justifying. To me, that discourse is justifying not exercising the other aspects that are also human nature. So it's a justification for bad behavior, I think, for selfish behavior. That's the way I would respond to what you said.
Yeah, definitely, because
Thanks, Melissa.
when people say, I'm only human, it's always to justify a mistake. It's always to normalize a wrong. And it's always to try to rationalize something that is maybe not good for the other.
Yes.
Yet, as Melissa says, there's a lot about human nature that should do with good.
Exactly.
That should do with coexistence.
Yes, exactly.
That should do with symbiosis and recognition
Yes.
of the life in other people, other places, and in other things. The things that we've thingified, objectified, but that are really part of the existence.
Yes,
around
and
us.
part of human capacities.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, we talk about, we probably would say we've got to find a different way of doing human, but actually it's all part of our package as human beings. It's just a matter of what do we want to justify, what do we want to encourage, you know, in ourselves and in each other. Do we want to appeal to I'm going to say the better side of our nature or not, you know? But the better side of our nature, the things we talked about, kindness, generosity, all those, require less selfishness. So that's I think why people want to avoid it and justify
Exactly.
bad behavior.
I like the points around the question of like humility and sort of going back to what's maybe our term like basics of sort of the question of empathy, the question of acknowledging our differences and coexisting within these differences, which also brings me to I think one of the constructions that relate to human and who belongs, particularly because we live in an era where which is very state and border dominated, which is the question of citizenship, which we always talk about. That there's also the construction of the citizen, which ties greatly to the question of the human. In moments where, for example, asylum seekers and refugees become non-human to the state, and these asylum camps and refugee sort of accommodations or rehabilitation centers are to a very large degree dehumanizing, and I think to jump from that point, the question of incarceration also comes to mind, where we find that people that have committed crime and now live now sort of imprisoned. Are basically living in very sort of well, I don't know what that means, but non-human conditions, where they are treated in a way that is different from the ordinary citizen in terms of the food they get, the treatment they get, and also our assumption as sort of citizens on the kind of treatment they deserve. And I always hear when people say, why are prisoners demanding for this and that? They're prisoners and they have to sort of deal with it and live with the fact that they've committed a crime. So this question of incarceration and I think further reading would take you to sort of the Foucauldian idea of disciplining and punishing, also even mental health institutions that rehabilitate people that have mental health challenges, are also spaces where people become maybe half human or second-class citizens.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kudzai, and I think one could add to your list, homelessness.
Oh, yes.
You know, homeless people are often also treated as people without, go back to your point about human rights, as not having the right to access human rights. And things like they don't have a home, but there's also this suggestion that they shouldn't be on the streets. Well, where should you be?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and yes, the ways in which they get constructed with all the forms of othering that we know, that they're dangerous, that they're unclean, that they're naturally criminals, and that sort of thing that also detracts from their humanity. And also when they get put into these homes, safe homes, it requires of them giving up agency. You know, they have to, the focus is always on like keeping the place clean and stuff like that. And then they don't have any autonomy over their lives and over the spaces where they live, which means they have to give up a huge part of their humanity in order to have a roof over their heads.
Great. Yeah. Yes. Your conversation, Melissa and Kudzai, has really illuminated one issue of humility as decolonial. To be humble is really to work against conquest and the arrogance that came with it. For life to be the funeral that it is, and the world to be the cemetery that it is, and not for life to be the festival that it should be, is because of our lack of humility and of the failure to recognize life in other people and in other things. If more humility circulated, there will be more sharing of homes, of food, of all the other life forces and life resources that are in the world. But that lack of humility it should be the first coloniality in my mind. Which, if we decolonize, if we work against, the world will really be the better place that it should be.
But William, it's so interesting because you make me think that we live within a system that rewards competition, not cooperation, and self-promotion, not relationship, you know. And so yeah, what you're saying, we're really up against a whole system that tries to bring out the opposite in human beings. So I think, I think we've had a really thought-provoking conversation. Thank you, for your insights. And I think, I've certainly going away from our conversation with a whole lot of new thoughts.
Same here.
Appreciate it.
This was great conversation.
We should speak more.
We'll do it again.
We should speak more.
We'll do it again.
Yeah.
Yes. This idea that society actually doesn't mind losing certain people.
Society, as it is organized now, produces what Walter Mignolo has called dispensable bare lives. Lives that society can do without.
Visibility of disability, right, which is recognizing and celebrating the lived experiences of everyone.
We live in a very ableist society, and a non-disabled person myself, there's always this inherent assumption, which is the norm.